On July 26, 1943, at 9:42 in the morning, Major Richard Bong leveled his P-38 Lightning at 20,000 feet over Lae, New Guinea. The twin Allison engines maintained cruise power at 2,000 RPM, and the altimeter needle held steady while he scanned the airspace below through breaks in scattered cumulus clouds. 4 dark silhouettes moved in a loose formation at 15,000 feet Mitsubishi, a 6 M0s, their elliptical wings distinct against the green canopy of the jungle. The mission briefing had designated this sector for bomber escort, but the B-25 seconds had already passed through 20 minutes earlier, leaving the sky empty except for the Japanese patrol. Bong checked his fuel gauges, 130 gallons remaining in the mains, enough for another hour of combat operations, and confirmed his wingman's position 300 yards to his right. They called the P-38 slow. Japanese intelligence reports recovered after the Battle of the Coral Sea described the Lightning as heavy and unable to maneuver, and pilots returning from engagements over Port Moresby had filed assessments claiming the twin-engine fighter could not compete with the Zero's turning capability. The analysis was accurate in one dimension. The Zero's turn radius measured approximately 500 feet at combat speed, while the P-38 required nearly 1,200 feet to complete the same circle. At weights of 5,313 pounds for the Zero versus 17,500 pounds for the Lightning, a difference of 3.3 to 1, physics supported the Japanese conclusion. The Nakajima Sakai radial engine produced 950 horsepower to move a machine built without armor plating or self-sealing fuel tanks, every component designed to minimize mass, but the reports had measured only horizontal performance. Bong rolled the P-38 30 degrees left and closed both throttles. The nose dropped through the horizon, and the twin booms tilted into a 45-degree dive as gravity and weight began their work. The airspeed indicator climbed past 250 miles per hour, then 300, then 350, as the altimeter unwound through 18,000 feet. Below, the lead Zero broke left in a defensive turn, recognizing the threat from above, but the maneuver cost him speed while Bong's dive accelerated through 420 miles per hour. At 1,000 yards distance, the Zero pulled harder, attempting a climbing turn that would force the P-38 into a turning fight where the Japanese fighter held every advantage. The tactic had worked against P-40 Warhawks throughout 1942. Allied pilots who accepted the invitation to turn had died in their cockpits. Bong held the dive. At 500 yards, he opened fire 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose where convergence errors could not exist. The burst lasted 2 seconds. The Zero's left wing separated at the root, and the aircraft tumbled into a fireball at 12,000 feet. Bong pulled 4 Gs and leveled the dive at 5,000 feet with the airspeed still reading 470 miles per hour. He opened both throttles to military power and pulled the nose vertical. The 3 surviving Zeros banked hard right, attempting to cut across his climb angle, but their maximum speed of 331 miles per hour could not match the P-38's 470. They pulled tighter, turning inside the Lightning's wider radius, gaining the angle they needed for a deflection shot. But Bong was already passing through 10,000 feet, at a climb rate of 4,750 feet per minute. The Zeros, having burned their speed in the turn, struggled to follow at 3,100 feet per minute. 45 seconds after the firing pass, Bong leveled at 18,000 feet and rolled wings level. The Zeros remained at 12,000 feet, circling in tight defensive patterns, searching the sky above them. Bong checked his gauges. Fuel, 120 gallons. Ammunition, 700 rounds 50 caliber, 140 rounds 20mm. He noted the time 0947 and keyed the radio once to signal his wingman. The P-38 seconds turned east toward base. Below, the 3 Zeros continued their circles, banking steeper now, tightening their formation. They had the turn radius, they had the maneuverability, they had the sky below 15,000 feet, but the altitude above belonged to the Lightning. The Zeros banked again. The sky remained empty. The engines ran steady at cruise power. Altitude, 18,000 feet. At Port Moresby, New Guinea, in September 1942, General George Kenny assembled 50 pilots in a canvas operations tent and delivered a directive that would define fighter combat in the Pacific theater for the remainder of the war. The 49th Fighter Group's Flying Knights had spent the previous 6 months flying P-40 Warhawks in defense of Darwin, Australia, where they had learned what happened when Allied pilots attempted to turn with Japanese Zeros at low altitude and low airspeed. Between March and August, the squadron had lost aircraft and pilots to an opponent whose turn radius and climb rate at speeds below 200 miles per hour exceeded anything American fighters could match. The assessment was simple. Dogfighting with Zeros in the horizontal plane was suicide. The solution required different physics. Kenny had requested 50 P-38 Lightning pilots from the United States, specifically because the twin-engine fighter offered capabilities the P-40 could not provide: superior speed, higher service ceiling, and the structural strength to survive high-speed dives that would tear the wings off lighter aircraft. The directive he issued that September morning was typed on a single page and distributed to every pilot in the tent. Never engage Japanese fighters in turning combat below 200 miles per hour. Use altitude advantage. Attack in the dive. Escape in the climb. The order was filed as 5th Air Force Tactical Doctrine on September 15, 1942, and violations were considered failures of discipline rather than failures of courage. Lieutenant Richard Bong, who had arrived in the Pacific that same month after training on P-38 seconds at Hamilton Field in California, attended the briefing and absorbed the mathematics. The Zero's empty weight of 3,984 pounds allowed it to turn inside any Allied fighter when both aircraft flew slowly, but that same light construction, achieved by eliminating armor, plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks, created structural limits the P-38 did not share. The Lightning's empty weight of 12,780 pounds meant it would never outturn a Zero in a flat circle, but in a vertical dive, mass became an advantage. Gravity accelerated both aircraft equally, but the P-38's stronger airframe could withstand speeds approaching 600 miles per hour, while the Zero's maximum dive speed was limited to 410 miles per hour before control surfaces began to flutter and structural failure became probable. Bong, who would later be selected to help train other pilots transitioning from P-40 seconds to P-38 seconds, developed a simple approach to combat: climb to altitude, wait for the enemy below, dive at maximum speed, fire one burst at close range to minimize the chance of missing, then use the speed from the dive to zoom back to altitude before the enemy could react. He considered it unsportsmanlike when opponents expected him to fight on their terms, and he felt no shame in breaking off an engagement when the tactical situation turned against him. The goal was to destroy enemy aircraft, not to prove maneuverability. The P-40 pilots had tried to prove maneuverability. Their names were recorded on casualty lists. The doctrine was distributed in September. By November, the 9th Fighter Squadron had received its first P-38 Lightnings. The aircraft were heavier, slower in turns, and unable to compete with the Zero in any measure of agility. They survived by refusing to turn at all. A fighter aircraft at 20,000 feet altitude holds potential energy equal to its mass, multiplied by gravitational acceleration multiplied by height above sea level. When the pilot pushes the stick forward and the nose drops below the horizon, that potential energy begins converting into kinetic energy, the energy of motion. The P-38 Lightning, with a loaded weight of 17,500 pounds, carried substantially more potential energy at altitude than the A-6M0, which weighed 5,313 pounds fully loaded. In level flight, this weight difference represented a disadvantage because the heavier aircraft required more lift to remain airborne and more thrust to accelerate. But in a dive, where gravity rather than engine power provided the primary accelerating force, the relationship reversed. The P-38's maximum speed in level flight was recorded at 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet when both Allison V-1710 engines operated at military power of 1,425 horsepower each. The Zero's maximum level speed measured 331 miles per hour at 14,930 feet, with its single Nakajima Sakai engine producing 950 horsepower. The difference of 83 miles per hour meant the P-38 could choose when and where to engage, approaching or departing from combat at will, while the Zero could not catch it in level flight. But the true performance gap appeared in the dive, where the P-38's all-metal stressed skin construction and twin-boom design allowed it to reach speeds approaching 600 miles per hour before encountering compressibility effects that made control difficult. The Zero's lighter construction, fabric-covered control surfaces, and an airframe optimized for weight reduction rather than structural strength limited its maximum dive speed to 410 miles per hour, beyond which flutter and potential structural failure became concerns documented in Japanese maintenance reports and Allied intelligence assessments. In vertical maneuvering, the P-38's climb rate of 4,750 feet per minute at sea level gave it an advantage over most Zero variants, which climbed at rates between 3,100 and 4,500 feet per minute, depending on the model and altitude. More significantly, the P-38's twin-turbo supercharged engines maintained power output at altitudes where the Zero's single unsupercharged engine began losing effectiveness. The service ceiling figures reflected this difference: 44,000 feet for the Lightning versus 33,000 feet for early Zero models and 36,000 feet for later variants. At 20,000 feet, where most combat occurred in the Southwest Pacific, the P-38 retained enough power to zoom climb after a high-speed diving attack, converting kinetic energy back into potential energy and regaining the altitude advantage before the enemy could respond. The tactical sequence that Richard Bong employed in nearly every engagement followed a consistent pattern documented in after-action reports filed between December 1942 and December 1944. He maintained patrol altitude between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, positioning himself above expected enemy routes and waiting for targets to appear below. When Japanese aircraft were spotted at lower altitude, he confirmed his escape route and fuel state before committing to attack. The dive began with throttles reduced to minimize engine noise and avoid overtaking the target too quickly. At a 45-degree dive angle, the P-38 accelerated from cruise speed to 400 or more miles per hour within 15 seconds, covering the vertical distance from 20,000 feet to attack altitude near 5,000 feet. The firing pass occurred at ranges between 200 and 400 yards, close enough that the nose-mounted armament of 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon could not miss, but far enough to avoid debris from the exploding target. After the burst, which typically lasted between 1 and 3 seconds, Bong pulled the aircraft into a climbing zoom, using the excess speed from the dive to regain altitude at rates that no pursuing Zero could match. Within 60 seconds of the firing pass, the P-38 was back above 15,000 feet, repositioning for another attack or departing the combat area entirely if outnumbered or low on fuel. Between his first confirmed victory on December 27, 1942, and his 40th on December 17, 1944, Bong destroyed 40 Japanese aircraft using variations of this single tactic over the course of more than 200 combat missions and 500 combat hours. The method was recorded in 5th Air Force tactical publications. Altitude converted to speed. Speed enabled the attack. The attack ended with a climb. The climb restored altitude. Zero radius of turn was never tested because the engagement never occurred in the horizontal plane. On December 17, 1944, Major Richard Bong was credited with his 40th aerial victory over Mindoro in the Philippines, establishing a record that remains unbroken as the highest score achieved by any American fighter pilot in any war. All 40 victories were confirmed as destroyed enemy aircraft. All were achieved while flying the P-38 Lightning, and all occurred in the Southwest Pacific area between December 1942 and December 1944. General Douglas MacArthur presented Bong with the Medal of Honor on December 14, 3 days before the final kill, and ordered him removed from combat operations in January 1945. Bong was 24 years old. He flew no further combat missions. He was sent to the United States for public relations duties and was subsequently assigned as a test pilot for the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, the first operational jet fighter produced by the United States. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Bong died when the P-80's fuel pump failed during takeoff from Burbank, California, and his parachute did not deploy before ground impact. Major Thomas Maguire achieved 38 confirmed victories, also flying exclusively the P-38 Lightning in the Southwest Pacific. On May 4, 1944, Maguire authored a tactical manual titled Combat Tactics in the Southwest Pacific Area, which codified the boom and zoom doctrine for 5th Air Force and specifically prohibited low-altitude turning engagements while carrying external fuel tanks. On December 25 and 26, 1944, Maguire shot down 7 Japanese fighters in 2 days, bringing his total to 38 and positioning him 2 victories behind Bong's record. On January 7, 1945, while leading a fighter sweep over Negros Island in the Philippines, Maguire's wingman was attacked by a Japanese Ki-43 Oscar flown by Warrant Officer Shoichi Sugimoto. Maguire turned to defend his wingman at an altitude of 300 feet, while still carrying drop tanks which he had not jettisoned. The P-38 stalled during the turn, snap-rolled inverted and impacted the ground. Maguire was killed instantly. He was 24 years old. His body was recovered by Filipino guerrillas and returned to the United States in 1949 for burial at Arlington National Cemetery. Maguire Air Force Base in New Jersey was named in his honor in January 1948. The P-38 Lightning was credited with the destruction of more Japanese aircraft than any other fighter type operated by the United States Army Air Forces in the Pacific Theater, with confirmed victories exceeding 1,800. More than 100 P-38 pilots achieved ace status by scoring 5 or more aerial victories. The aircraft's operational loss rate in the Pacific was recorded at 1.3%. In the second half of 1944, P-38 pilots operating from bases in Dutch New Guinea routinely flew combat missions covering 950 miles to target areas, engaged for 15 minutes, and returned to base. The doctrine was filed. The method was recorded. 40 aircraft destroyed, 2 pilots dead. The engine stopped. The gate closed. Silence.